afternoon, everybody. Welcome to this event that's co-hosted by the Mexico Institute of the Wilson Center and the Immigration Policy Center of the American Immigration Council. My name is Mary Giovanoli. I'm the director of the Immigration Policy Center, and our job in many ways is to try to ensure that the facts and the information that people need to do really good debate, analysis, and policy work on immigration is out there for you. We're part of the American Immigration Council, which is an organization that tries to address the very real and important issues about immigrants and immigration and both our heritage and our future in a variety of different ways, including through litigation, through policy, through an education center, and through visitor exchange programs, all designed to really help reinforce this notion that immigration is about all of us in the United States and about our partners around the world as well. So we're thrilled to be here with the Mexico Institute and with Eric Olson to introduce several new papers that the IPC has put out just today by two very gifted and very different individuals who have come to the same conclusion that we need to rethink border security and ask ourselves, what are we really talking about when we talk about what makes our borders secure? So let me do a couple of quick introductions, and then we'll turn it over to the real speakers. Eric Olson, at the other side of the table from me, is a senior associate at the Mexico Institute of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars in Washington, D.C. He focuses on U.S.-Mexico security cooperation and research on organized crime and drug trafficking between the U.S., Mexico, and Central America. Prior to joining the Wilson Center, he was at the Organization of American States, Amnesty International USA, and the Washington Office on Latin America. He's also worked in Mexico and Honduras, and he has degrees from American University and Trinity College. Next to Eric is Joe Hyman, who's a professor of anthropology and chair of the Department of Anthropology and Sociology at the University of Texas, El Paso. Joe's current work really looks deep down at border security, including a comprehensive review of U.S. border policies since 9/11. He's also doing research right now on the access and barriers to health care for immigrants and Latinos and Latinas in El Paso. Previously, he's worked on U.S. border enforcement, looking at U.S. border officers and the issues that face them, border communities and cultures, in a variety of ways that he really tries to piece together what it means to live in a border community. Joe's the author of several books and a number of scholarly articles and book chapters, and most recently, he published just today one of our papers, or one of his papers, but an IPC paper called Guns, Drugs, and Money, taking the real threats of border security. And then finally, right next to me, is Terry Goddard, who is a native of Tucson, Arizona, and has been a mainstay in Arizona politics for many years. He most recently served 2 terms as Arizona's Attorney General and 4 terms as the mayor of Phoenix. He also served in the U.S. Navy for 27 years. During the time that he's been engaged in public service, his work is really focused on law enforcement and increasing citizenship participation in government, revitalizing the downtown of Phoenix, and setting up nationally recognized programs in economic development, the arts, and historic preservation. Most recently, he's focused his attention, I think because of the tremendous work he did as Attorney General in Arizona, on protecting consumers and fighting the organized crime activities of drug cartels. He's made significant progress in that area, seizing approximately $20 million and culminating in a historic $94 million settlement against certain institutions that were engaged in money laundering operations.
Who will remain nameless.
With all of that, I'll turn it over to Eric.
Thanks so much, Mary, and it's indeed a delight for us at the Mexico Institute to co-sponsor this event with you at the Immigration Policy Center. I had the privilege of writing an article with David Shirk from USD Transporter Institute that you all published last year, I believe.
Yes, you did, and I apologize for not mentioning it.
No. I'm not fishing for a compliment here, but I was really more going to say I appreciated the opportunity to work with you all, and I think there may be some copies of that along with other stuff out in the hallway. Anyway, the real issue here is the question of border security, how we define it, how we discuss it, and I'm delighted that we have such experts here on the panel. I was taken back, reminded again, excuse me, not taken back, reminded again of how much of an issue that is by seeing the number of articles published over the last day or two in the context of the 9/11 commemoration, and the articles focusing on border security, especially on the southwest border. And if you'd indulge me just for a moment, I was reading one today published in the El Paso Times, your hometown.
Yes.
Did you see it?
I haven't, no, not
Okay,
today.
well, just a second.
I'm here.
It's called Illegal Border Crossings Down, More Officers, Border Wall Deter Immigrants. And the focus of this, of course, is that at least so far as the El Paso sector is concerned, apprehensions of migrants crossing are significantly down in that sector. I think it's gone down from 120-some thousand to about 12,000, and projections are for 10,000 apprehensions going forward. And the reason, of course, they're giving in the context of this article is exactly that. More officers on the ground, more officers at the border, an extended fence, and more focus on that border. And I think the question we want to wrestle with today, and we will hear from our speakers about, is whether that's truly the best way to ensure border security. Is that what we mean by border security? What are these questions that we're wrestling with? I think these issues will become more and more a topic of debate as the U.S. and Mexico enter into their electoral and presidential campaigns. One of the things that I think is really key in this debate is not just definition, because I think we all agree more security is better than less security, but how, in fact, how do you do that, and what's the best way to conceive of improving security? One of the issues in this article was that the Border Patrol agent, and I don't want to single him out as somehow a scapegoat here, but was asked, what's your primary responsibility? And they said, fighting terrorism. Since 9/11, my primary responsibility, he said, is fighting terrorists and capturing terrorists. The question then was posed, the obvious question, well, how many terrorists have you captured in your sector? And the answer is, of course, none. So, it leaves us a question of, are the priorities the right ones? How do we define security along the border? So I'm delighted to have Joel and Terry here to talk to us and enlighten us on a number of these issues. We'll have plenty of time for dialogue and discussion afterwards. I forgot to acknowledge a few people in the room. There's representatives here from the Mexican Embassy, from the Salvadoran Embassy, many of our colleagues in the think tank world and universities. Andrew Seeley's here as the director of Mexico Institute, so glad to have you with us. And take it away, Joe.
Thank you very much. Thank you to everybody for being here. Thank you to the Immigration Policy Center and the Wilson Center for hosting this. It's a good place to pick up from what Eric was mentioning, which is the apparent success of the border enforcement policy in reducing the number of arrests. You may or may not know there's a debate as to whether this is a artifact of the Great Recession in the United States and also of bottling people up inside the United States versus actually deterring people from crossing the border. I want to say that while that's an important debate, that's not the central question. The central question is stopping labor migrants and family migrants a contribution to human security? Is it really a security matter? And I want to start off by observing that since 1993, which is the time of the first World Trade Center bombings, which were really our first warning of that type of international terrorism, and since 9/11, and now since the rise of extreme violence inside of Mexico, the essential mission of the U.S. government on the southwestern border has not changed, We frankly should not be calling it the Department of Homeland Security. We should be calling it the Department of Unselective Mass Migration Enforcement. Okay? It is not contributing
Not
to...
a good acronym.
Yes, not a good acronym, right. It doesn't make you feel happier and warmer and fuzzier the way security does. What is very striking about our border policy is the level of continuity in spite of 9/11. The devotion of the vast majority of the resources to spaces intercepting people crossing in between ports of entry from Mexico and Central America on the southwestern border, even though 9/11 hijackers came through airports from other parts of the world. Now, I want to say that we need to go back to the basics. We need to rethink and reprioritize what we do in the way of contributing to security. So this is not simply an argument against border enforcement, nor an argument against security. In fact, I take the risk, for example, of Mexican smuggling organizations moving international terrorists as at least a plausible risk, although not in actuality. And I'll speak to that. We need to be fiscally responsible. We're spending over $10 billion a year in southwestern border enforcement. We have invested many, many billions of dollars in a wonderful piece of infrastructure, the border wall. We have the largest federal law enforcement organization, the Border Patrol, 90% allocated to the southwestern border, and so forth and so on. Okay. So in order to be fiscally responsible, we have to think about how would we prioritize security. We're really facing at least three issues at the southwestern border. We're facing migration, we're facing the money, guns, drugs complex, and I said it in that order deliberately, and I think Mr. Goddard will talk about that more, and we're facing terrorism. Each of those issues, they have different dynamics, and they have different enforcement responses. They have different public values. In the paper that you have, I propose that we take a three-step risk prioritization analysis, that we look at what is the frequency of the issue. Unauthorized migration is very frequent. There's never been a terrorist cross the southwestern border. We take the threat or the harm of the issue. Unauthorized migration has no real harm in terms of threatening the physical safety of civilians. You can debate its public policy values, whether it's a contribution or a detriment by tiny percentages, by the way, to the economy. But it's not a threat issue at all. And you talk about the feasibility of the response. How possible is it to make any difference? When you put each of these issues through that, you come to the conclusion that we should be attentive to the risks of terrorism, that we should be very concerned about the risks, the potential risks of violence. We should be very concerned about the real threat of violence in Mexico and the potential risks of violence going between Mexico and the United States. I say that even though El Paso is genuinely the safest city in the United States, in spite of the fact that many politicians don't want to believe that, and that there really is essentially no spillover violence. I mean, there's some drug trafficking violence of low-level organizations occasionally, and a couple of bullets have bounced off buildings. But there's not spillover violence. But the level of armed weaponry and violence in Mexico is very, very serious and very bad, and so we should be attentive to that potential threat. It would be foolish not to be. And certainly in terms of our responsibility for the real violence inside of Mexico, we should be attentive to that. So I want to make a couple of quick observations based on that analysis, and then I'll turn it over to Mr. Goddard. First of all, I want to say that if we want to avoid the movement, the potential for the movement of terrorists and terrorist materials through Mexico, which again I underline has not occurred up to this point, but if we want to avoid the potential for that, we need to stop breeding super organizations. What we are doing in terms of our border policy, which is going after low-level smugglers of people and commodities, we are doing something that's very similar to the misuse of antibiotics that breeds multi-drug resistant infections. We are creating organizations that are capable of moving dangerous people across the border. For example, historically, human coyotaje, the movement of people, the business of moving people from Central America and Mexico to the United States through that border, was very separate from the drug-based criminal organizations. Now we're seeing the drug-based criminal organizations move into, to some extent, which is still debated, move into smuggling, either in a parasitical way or as a business. That's a very bad development. That is a negative byproduct of our current mass enforcement border policy. We should be avoiding that like the plague. We should be reducing the effectiveness of those organizations, not increasing the effectiveness. We should be reducing the value of those organizations. We should look back with nostalgia on the mom and pop smugglers of the past. I'm serious. I mean, both on behalf of the Mexican people and on behalf of the risks that they pose to the United States. And another issue that we need to be addressing right now is the understaffing and under-prioritization and underfunding of the ports of entry, and the overstaffing and over-prioritization and overfunding of the Border Patrol, the organization that operates in between the ports of entry. For a number of reasons, Susan Ginsburg did a very fine study of this. There's good reason to believe that dangerous people are most likely to move through ports of entry with legitimate documents or falsified legitimate documents, but anyway, through quick, efficient, safe, low rate of detection ways moving through ports of entry. We know we're certain, the government doesn't really like to publicize this, but buried in their reports they indicate that most of the drug trafficking moving northward goes through ports of entry. The southbound trafficking of bulk cash and of weaponry goes southbound through ports of entry. The spaces in between ports of entry, the mental image that people have in the political sphere of the border is remarkably misleading and reduces our security level in this country. We need to invest in ports of entry. This is oftentimes phrased as only a commercial consideration. The commerce through the ports of entry is immensely important, but it's also a security consideration. Ports of entry are excellent places to monitor the flows of people and commodities, the flows of people and commodities that are good, that are beneficial to us, but also those that are potential risks and threats. So with that, I think I'll turn it over to Terry, who has a lot more to say that's specific about what we could be doing.
Before you start, though, I think I neglected to mention that your article is also released today called How to Fix a Broken Border, Hit the Cartels Where It Hurts. And this is part 1 of 3. So this is actually launching a whole series of papers that Terry is doing for the Immigration Policy Center as a senior fellow with the IPC.
Thank you, Mary. Thank you, Professor. Eric's story about the perfect record of the Border Patrol on the southwest border reminds me of the extermination company in Tucson, Arizona that advertised that they specialized in dinosaur removal, and they had a 100% record of success against reinfestation. I bring, without any apologies, a law enforcement perspective to this discussion, and if you look at the two papers, you'll think that Professor Hyman and I got together and sort of decided that we'd emphasize the same points. Truth of the matter is we didn't. I read his paper over the weekend, and I thought, well, you know, how did you come to the same conclusions I did? Bear in mind that I started in a completely different place. I have been the Arizona AG for the last 8 years. I was born and raised in Tucson, Arizona. I have at least some personal experience with a fairly long history of border-related issues in that region, which has now become so symbolic in the national debate. And one of my frustrations and the reason for agreeing to write this piece was twofold. One, the mischaracterizations I thought were extraordinary, and second, the miscarriages, if in fact our goal as a nation is border security. It seemed from the law enforcement perspective we were going about it in just about exactly the opposite manner. Robert Frost, in his Mending Wall poem, as I'm sure everyone is well aware, said, if you're going to build a fence, you need to figure out who you're walling out and who you're walling in. And that perspective has been missing from this whole discussion. Obviously, we have some serious issues to contend with. Terrorism after 9/11, certainly yesterday we were reminded over and over again of how real and present a concern that is for the United States. We certainly read and hear a lot about cartel violence in Mexico, and the carnage has been extraordinary, and I know many people are worried about that. The drug phenomenon is certainly not new, but has gotten a lot of focus recently, and the presence of illegal workers in this country has become a political cause célèbre. So what are our security problems? Causing both sides of the debate on immigration to say, now with some agreement, that the first thing we have to do is secure the border. It's a rallying cry, many politicals in Arizona and across the country. And my question simply from the law enforcement perspective is, what do they mean by that? And secure against who? Because you can't simultaneously have a policy that goes against migrant workers and is also effective against terrorists. You've got to make some choices. And I'm afraid that if I had one overriding criticism of our current efforts, we didn't make those choices. We're trying to basically go against all kinds of different problems, and I think the result is we're not very effective against any of them. Let me go back to, it may not surprise you that I'm from Arizona and I have a state-centered solution to this problem. Not exactly the 1070 solution, but nonetheless, maybe it comes from some similar roots, because I was very concerned about the whole issue of human smuggling. We saw that as a form of trafficking in many cases, where people were held as virtual prisoners and coming through our state in extraordinary numbers. 8 years ago, almost 9 years ago now, when I first went into the job, somebody asked me what my major challenge was, and I said, well, I really think it's the 1 million people, give or take a few, that are coming across the border in Cochise County, home of Tombstone and some of the other sort of epic western parts of the state of Arizona, but also some of the most rugged desert country in the world. Because I don't think the country really realizes what a tide of migration is coming. Well, now they may realize it, just about the time the tide of migration seems to be waning. But it clearly was a huge concern. And we went after it with one of the only tools we had as law enforcement agencies. We didn't have the authority to police the border. That was Border Patrol's issue. We didn't patrol the ports. That was Customs. But we did think that there was an awful lot of money coming into our state that maybe we could do something about. And so we took a state-based anti-money laundering approach. We ended up in a long-term battle with a apparently unnamed money transmitting organization, the initials of which are WU. And that led to eventually a settlement in February of last year, which caused some major changes in the way they did business, and a $50 million program put in place to attack border crime using state and local resources. I'm very proud of that, and I think we made some major progress. My frustration throughout that was that we had no federal assistance, or virtually none. I'll never forget appearing at the Department of Treasury to talk about some actions that I thought should be taken from the federal level, and being told that our antagonists, the company that we had basically taken a number of their agent representatives in Arizona and put them in prison, was a model financial institution. And I found that a little hard to understand. $600 million approximately a year was coming into Arizona by wire transfer. Last year, $3 million was coming into Arizona. What happened in the meantime was approximately 18 warrants that we served, basically seizing funds that appeared to be part of Herman smuggling operations. They appeared to be by where they were picked up, the volumes in which they flowed, and the amounts of the transaction characteristic of what we believe to be payment for bringing somebody into this country illegally. It was fairly successful. We seized about $20 million, obviously a drop in the bucket compared to the $600 million a year, but nonetheless it caused major changes in behavior, resulting in now $3 million instead of $600 million coming into the state of Arizona. I wish I could say that changed the criminal activity. I know it didn't. The cartels are extremely flexible, they're opportunistic, and they simply move their operations either immediately south of the border into Sonora or into other states in the United States, into Texas and New Mexico and California. I don't know exactly because it's hard to trace and I don't have that information. What we did, however, through our settlement was made available to federal and local authorities a massive treasure trove of data about financial information as it flows across the border. And we also, through an agreement, made that available to the PGR in Mexico, so that law enforcement at least now has a huge tool to track that part of the money. But we'll keep coming back to the idea that if you're fighting organized crime, you need to start with the money that keeps them in the business. The folks that create the mayhem south of the border and threaten us north of the border are not doing it out of religious zeal, and they're not doing it because they love the work, I'm assured. They do it because they're incredibly well compensated. And it seems to me the number one issue in terms of making a difference on the border and making it more secure is to first and foremost attack that money. Well, our experience with wire transfer, which is only part of the issue, was extremely unsatisfactory. We did our job, but the federal government and the other states did not. And I believe that goes into other aspects. I became and testified in Congress a number of times about stored value instruments, now renamed prepaid access cards by the Department of Treasury. But here's something that was identified by the federal government 6 years ago as being a major opportunity for money laundering used by the drug dealers and the cartel operatives to move money across the border, apparently with impunity, because none of the reports required by other financial transactions were required for these cards. Not until later this month will the final rule, after 10 years of virtual inaction in this booming industry, will a final rule that attempts to deal with stored value instruments be put in place in the United States. That's extraordinary to me. I mean, the identification was made by the federal agencies 6 years ago. People knew about it long before that, and the reaction is just now happening. Funnel accounts, massive amounts, massive bank accounts that basically have collaborators on both sides of the border, again, moving billions. The Wachovia case that now people know about, but it was kind of a secret, $390+ billion in 3 years was moved by one bank between the United States and Mexico. I'm not saying it was all illegal proceeds, but a great deal of it obviously was. So without that facilitation of the organizations that are so adept at moving across our border, we would be making far greater progress. Let me talk for a minute about the organizations themselves. I think there's a tendency here in Washington to deal or to be somewhat condescending about the criminal organizations that are operating primarily out of Mexico, truly international criminal operations. And I don't mean to characterize them as being characteristic of any particular country, because they're not. They've moved their operations throughout the world. What we know from the southwest border is they're incredibly sophisticated, very opportunistic, and able to find the seams in any defense pattern and exploit those seams. They are very quick, as we saw in our anti-money laundering efforts on wire transfers. About 3 days was all it took from the time we issued a warrant to the time that the people that were sending the money had gotten all of their operatives retrained to change the way it was structured and to essentially make our warrants completely inoperative. That was the long time. Sometimes it took significantly shorter periods than that. Quickly to go through the other point, and I think the organization is something that we need to watch in any organized crime prosecution. You go after the leaders of those organizations. You find anything you possibly can find to take them down and to then dismember the operation. Money's number one, but the second one is the leadership and the people that are very sophisticated in finding ways. Professor has described them as like a virus that becomes immune to the antibiotic. And frankly, that's a pretty apt analogy because we have essentially trained criminal organizations on the southwest border to get better and better at avoiding exactly what we do, which is trying to protect that border. And right now, I would say you could double the number of Border Patrol again. It's been doubled once, and not provide significantly greater deterrence to illegal entry, either for drugs or for human beings. Because right now, the combination of communication, intelligence, and rapid transportation that is used to bring people and drugs across the border and into the interior of our country is incredibly sophisticated, and it would be very hard to stop it. So my answer from the law enforcement perspective is go after the organization. Find those people. Any country that can find Osama bin Laden wherever he's hiding in Pakistan I think, can find Chapo Guzman and the head of the Sinaloa cartel and have him arrested, along with, obviously, Mexican cooperation. Couldn't be done as a solo operation, but certainly I believe the Republic of Mexico is ready to go after Chapo and certainly has proven they can go after the other leaders of the cartels. Two other quick points. Professor Hyman made the first one, and that is I think our biggest vulnerability right now is not the spaces in between, but the ports themselves. That's where the staffing has been totally inadequate to the rise in demand of commercial traffic through NAFTA. And I believe the next big scandal, I hate to be predictive of things like this, but it's going to be customs agents who are on the take. We've already seen a few, over 100 have been prosecuted in the past several years. But right now, I think that it should be no surprise to anybody who's watched the criminal organizations that they prosper because they threaten and because they bribe. And I know that agents in Nogales and other port cities are being threatened and bribed at the same time. And that's going to result, and already has resulted, I believe, in a great deal of contraband coming right through the front door into this country. The last point I'd like to make is about training. Right now, Mexico, and it doesn't get much credit for this, is in the process of a historic change in their criminal prosecution procedures. They're going from basically a Code Napoleon style of having criminal trials through affidavit in secret, where I think the success rate in terms of criminal prosecution is about 1.55%, to a public trial similar to the U.S. system with live interrogation of witnesses and obviously a transparent or public proceeding. I commend that. I think it's a terrific thing to be doing in the course of the kind of battle they're doing with organized crime. It's an amazing and very heroic undertaking. Through the Merida Initiative monies, the United States has been helping with that, and my fellow attorney generals have been doing a lot of the training. Over 2,000 prosecutors have been trained in the last couple of years, and now we're working on the judges. Inexplicably, and I think it's indicative of the kind of lack of coordination that is endemic in our border protection, the State Department just cut the training funds in half. I've not seen an explanation for that. It frankly is astonishing to me that something that's so inexpensive, I think the matter was between $6 and $3 million, or maybe I'm a little high, but it's a fairly small number, that was potentially revolutionizing the ability to bring organized criminals to the table, prosecute them successfully, and put them in prison. Bringing down a big part of the cartel operation has been essentially cut back in this country, and I would plead for its reinstitution. So bottom line, I think time is critical. Eric made the mention that we have presidential elections in both countries in 2012. I think it's highly unlikely that the current Mexican administration's dedication to fighting the cartels is going to continue, at least to the same zeal, in a subsequent administration. And so we have about a year. If the United States is going to work effectively with Mexico to take down, I think, the major threat to our border security, and that's the organized criminals south of the border, we need to move quickly, and we need to do a much more effective job of catching the money, going after the organized leaders, and protecting our ports. Thank you.
Thank you. We're going to open up for questions here in just a minute. I mean, I guess there are a couple of issues that emerge for me in this discussion that I think are worth pondering a little bit. On the one hand, you've both emphasized that putting more boots on the ground at the border is probably not the most efficient way, since we don't exactly know what it is we're trying to keep out and what we're trying to keep in. So that raises one issue. On the other hand, I was struck again as I was reading the papers today that you both talked about this port of entry issue. So it's not like no presence at the border is the answer either. There is clearly some presence at the border needed, and you're really just suggesting that it be more focused on the ports of entry. The second big thing is, though, that maybe focus on the word border is mistaken, and we need to think about security generally, and that taking the discussion away from that physical point is an important element here. Again, the way to stop money laundering isn't just having more people stand at the border and do inspections. There may be some role there, but I think your work in Arizona against, I guess we're not supposed to say it, right? This company that does wire transfers is indicative that you don't do that all at the border.
A newly enlightened corporation.
Newly enlightened corporation. You know, sometimes the issue that was touched on in the papers, but we didn't mention here, was the issue of weapons going southward. And this has been a huge issue for the Mexican president, the Mexicans themselves, who feel like there's a flood of weapons across the border. I often hear U.S. Policymakers, suggest the answer is that do more inspections southward to stop that flow. We know full well that we're not very effective stopping things coming north. I don't know why we would think we'd be any more successful stopping things going south. But the question then becomes, how do you deal with the issue of weapons? And I think there's been a long discussion about changing the laws that are on the books and all that. But it is a complicated issue. And for me, at least, focusing that kind of southbound traffic enforcement at the border is really probably not the most efficient. I suspect you both agree with that.
I think you need to stop the guns, but that's...
Well, stop the guns, right.
I think that I have two thoughts about this question of the guns in general and southbound enforcement. I think a very important point that most people don't know about southbound enforcement is that most of the successful stops are made on the basis of police detective work. Mm-hmm. It's intelligent enforcement. And what most characterizes U.S. border security policy is unintelligent enforcement. Mm. It's stumbling into somebody crossing southward or stumbling into somebody crossing northward. It is not just a question of should we be enforcing at the ports of entry more, should we be enforcing southbound more, but should we be investing in intelligence? Should we be investing in intelligent enforcement? Because our paradigm for border enforcement is arresting people walking through the desert. And until we change out of that vision of what border enforcement consists of, we're not going to be any more effective southbound than we are northbound. The second thing I want to say is I think that maybe in this room today and in other places like this, we need to turn the tide back against the offense that's being launched against ATF and gun enforcement by the National National Weapons and Munition Dealer Lobby, also known as the NRA. Frankly, they have taken advantage of the tragic killing of Agent Terry in order to work on their agenda, which is to make it impossible to enforce gun laws. And that is causing the deaths of many thousands of people, tens of thousands of people in Mexico. But in addition to which, we haven't really examined that specific incident, where a Border Patrol unit was assigned to go after bandits who were operating in the border in this interface zone between sophisticated, dangerous smuggling organizations, armed bandits, and human trafficking, human smuggling. So we need to get the human smuggling business out of that area. We won't be putting people like Agent Terry in as much danger if we get out of that low-level type of enforcement situation and we start to have a smarter approach towards enforcing the law going in both directions.
Harry, you want to say?
Well, I work with ATF. I certainly don't... I don't approve of Fast and Furious. Let's put that on the record. I think it was, to the degree they let that many guns go across the border, it's inexcusable. But I would make 2 points. One, if we could do a more effective job of stopping the flow of funds, obviously the money that buys those guns would not be so incredibly plentiful. The border in the case of Wachovia, as I think everyone's well aware, was Miami. It wasn't any part of what we normally think of as the southwest border, but it was bankers using electronic transfers and digital information nowhere near the physical border that put, I believe the number is $378 billion in 3 years into casas de cambio in Mexico, much of which was laundered for the cartels. That could do more to stop the violence, it seems to me, if we could cut off that kind of aberration, that kind of serious abrogation of our own anti-money laundering laws that are in effect today. The second part is there's a major case that I led that was refused by the Department of Justice against one person and one organization called Excalibur Arms in Phoenix, Arizona. And unfortunately, we were unsuccessful in state court at bringing that prosecution. But inexplicably, it was dismissed by the federal authorities, too. I still don't have any clear understanding as to why that happened, because when they had the shootout and the head of the Beltran Leyva organization was killed, I believe in Mexico City, 3 officers died. Several civilians were killed and many others wounded in that shootout. And 6 of the guns that were used by the cartel operatives came from Excalibur Arms within a few months of that particular incident. There was a shootout in Nogales, Sonora, where the head of their state police was, the Sonora State Police was murdered. Again, 2 of the guns found on the scene directly came from a dealer in Phoenix and went through straw buyers into Mexico. We could do a much better job. Fast and furious to the sidelines, just enforcing, as Eduardo Medina Mora told us as a group of attorney generals. He said if the U.S. would just enforce its own rules, we would be much better off in terms of the flood of guns coming into Mexico.
And I want to pick up on a broader theme that Eric mentioned, which is the question of whether we should be doing these things at borders and to what extent we should be thinking automatically of the border as the perfect place of defense. And I have a number of reflections on that and discussions of that in the essay, which I'm not going to go over now. But I would propose that we start with the word security and ask ourselves what protects civilians against violent harm, and then ask to what extent does the border serve that, or do other mechanisms serve that? And I think a big part of the problem with our policy of the last 20 years and with our enormous investment, sunken investment in things like the wall, have been that we've started with border and we haven't started with security. It's really quite scandalous, genuinely scandalous, that the United States has above all responded to 9/11 by building a wall on the Mexican border.
Okay, on those upbeat comments. Miguel has got the microphone. If you wouldn't mind waiting until he gives you the microphone and identifying yourself. We're recording this to be later put on our web page. So we'll start with Andrew Seeley and then Ted, and then we have one here. Okay.
Andrew Seeley from the Wilson Center. 2 quick questions, and I apologize, I'm going to have to step out in a second, but referring to things that you talked about, to what extent, I mean, one thing that's concerned us, I mean, Eric and I have talked about this a lot, and have talked to a number of other people in the administration, is that we don't seem to have the same energy at a federal level in going after money laundering that has to do with organized crime groups in Mexico and Central America that we do with Al-Qaeda, for example, or terrorist. We do know a lot. Now, granted, a lot of the money's moving in bulk cash, but whatever moves in the financial system, we've actually been fairly good at developing sophisticated techniques to go after terrorist financing. We haven't seem to put the same energy into dealing with the Mexican organizations.
You tell me.
Yeah. Well, no. So, well, and the other is the mapping. I mean, we know a lot about how the cartels operate in Mexico. We have good operational intelligence on the ground in the U.S., but we don't seem to have a good mapping of how the cartels operate in the U.S. Once they get across the border, where are the houses where they put together, before it gets to the border, where do they put together the bulk cash? You know, where are the arms gathered? I mean, all this sort of basic mapping stuff. we don't seem to have done very effectively. Correct me if I'm wrong on this.
No.
Yeah, I think those
No,
are.
I don't think you are wrong. The lack of, excuse me if occasionally my little remaining hair is on fire about this, because, looking at an organized criminal operation, wherever it may exist, the almost textbook answer is, well, first you find them their pocketbook and you hit it hard. And we've just failed to do that, whether it's the basic rules against money laundering, whether it's more sophisticated layering that takes place with money brokers now using the black market peso exchange. It's been analyzed to death, but the prosecutions haven't followed. And when Wachovia walks through the door and has no criminal prosecution, somebody said once the best way to make sure that this gets people's attention is the clatter of handcuffs in the boardroom. I applaud that. I think a few handcuffs in the boardroom were highly appropriate when billions of dollars are being, in violation of our laws, are going across the border illegally. The mapping is fascinating. My experience in terms of individual cartel-related prosecutions is that they are not bringing the family or the organization into the United States. They are the masters of contracting out. And you have, in essence, a very sophisticated network, a redundant network of private concerns, many of them formerly very legitimate organizations, that are then contracted at very, very impressive profits to do the cartel's work. And so whether it's the cars for bringing people from the border to the center of Arizona, or the tickets to fly them to the south, or a whole variety of other, whether it's the houses that are necessary to house people, that's not done through the cartel organization. It's done because they find American companies who are only too happy to do business with them. And when you're a travel agent and somebody walks in with a list of 50 names and says, I'm going to pay cash, I'd like to have one-way tickets between Las Vegas and destinations in the southern part of the United States for these 50 people, who of course are nowhere around, and I'm willing to pay you 10 to 20% above the market price for these tickets, you would think that somebody would just get an inkling that perhaps something illegal was being asked of them, and nobody complained. So I don't know that the mapping would be that sophisticated, because this is not mafia we're dealing with. This is a new age and a new type of criminality.
I would add something which is a more general observation, but I think that we do need to change some of the frames by which we think of these things. These are Western Hemispheric transnational criminal organizations. They operate just as much in the United States, if not more, than in Mexico or in the Andes. I would emphasize that these are issues that are deeply worked into American society. I mean, we're somewhat aware of that in terms of drug consumption. We certainly should be aware of that in terms of our attitude towards guns and munition. And I think we're seeing the tip of the iceberg as far as the money goes. But we cannot really make a difference in these processes over the long run if we don't look inside our own nation.
Somebody said calling them Mexican cartels is like calling Chrysler an American auto company.
Right.
Right? It really isn't anymore. Go ahead, Ted.
Ted Wilkinson, retired State Department veteran of 6 years in our embassy in Mexico, and now working on a course to be given to State Department officials going out to our border consulates and Monterey, which we're going to be giving a one-week course to be given in December. I'm particularly interested in, we've heard from Mr. Goddard part one of how to fix the broken border. I want to know what's going to be in parts 2 and 3 in terms of overcoming.
Well, I'm saving the answer for last.
The resistance and inertia in Washington to addressing some of these issues that you've identified.
You have an answer? What's going to be
Seems like the sequel shouldn't be given away before. No, the next two parts have to do with going much deeper than I did in the first round of the nature of the financial transactions that first we found in Arizona through wire transfers, and then some of the structuring, layering, and and funnel accounts that we've seen more and more of as the cartels quickly move out of one form of moving money to another. They're as good as I imagine anybody's ever seen. The other is a far more on-the-ground look at why I said earlier that I considered these groups, I don't want to say anybody's unstoppable. I think we're capable of putting enough effort in the field to stop virtually any criminal operation if we choose to. But it would be incredibly expensive with the organization, what Professor Hyman has called the virus that has built in response to our level of border protection. The misnomer that I see, and I think it's very unfortunate, when the Secretary and the President say that we have the highest level of security on the border that we've ever had, the border's more secure than it's ever been in history. I think they're speaking sort of the world as they know it, because the effort has been so much greater. The problem and what is missed in that is that the opponent is so much more sophisticated that they keep leveling the ante higher. They're getting better and better at what they do. And what we've seen through successive prosecutions simply, I think, is not generally known, and that is just how good they are at the job they do of bringing people across the border so covertly. You know, the hydraulic ramps that skip the fence and never touch it, the night vision devices that they buy from the military that are available, the high-powered weapons. In fact, they can take down armored personnel carriers and low-flying aircraft with the guns in their disposal. I just don't think the general public is very aware of that, and I thought it was worth stressing that it would take, if you leave the organizations in place, which I think is our fundamental error, it would take an almost military precision to stop what they're trying to do at our border.
Great. We had a question here, Miguel.
Maria Berliner with Latin Intelligence. I have spent many years studying the transnational criminal organizations, not only in Latin America, but all over the world. And through my analysis, I have come to the conclusion, as you have pointed out, these are not per se criminal organizations. These are criminal global corporations with tremendous amounts of money to corrupt and collude. The Sinaloa Federation could not acquire the power that it has acquired only on money. There has been collusion and corruption both at the private and the public level. What can be done about that, if any?
I don't fully have an answer, and actually before the event, Eric and I were briefly talking about looking at historical cases where corruption was reduced. And so one of the things I think we need to be doing is looking at long-term cases where phenomena like this were taken down. Another example that has more to do with the criminal organizations relates to what Terry was saying, is that we vastly reduced the impact of the mafia, the Sicilian mafia, in the world, in the United States and other parts of the world. It's not totally gone, but that's a very interesting case of how criminal organizations were eventually taken down. So I think there are things that we can learn. I'm not the expert or the specialist on this. I'd encourage lots of you all to become the experts and specialists on this. The other thing that I would say is that I think there's an even broader sort of relationship. It's not a form of collusion, it's not a form of corruption, but there's a relationship. There's a relationship between central government budgets devoted to agencies like the Border Patrol and criminal organizations. For it's clear in the case of drug policy. Let's take legalization of marijuana. But we can think of many other aspects of border policy and drug policy. These organizations, government agencies, do not want the status quo to change. The status quo benefits their leadership and their budgets and their bureaucratic interests and their allies, the famous Iron Triangle in political science between the bureaucracies, the Homeland Security industrial complex, and congressional committees. It benefits that Iron Triangle immensely. And so I have a concern that there's a kind of both an opposition, a battle between law enforcement and the criminal organizations in some ways, but not necessarily really an interest in demobilizing them. Now, that my friend here may be very frustrated by me saying that, but I think that's really one of the things that's preventing us from reconsidering what we're doing and changing our policies.
Well, I think the number one thing I would propose to your question is that we get clear on our objectives. Right now, I don't think the objective is the demobilization and the elimination of the international criminal organizations. It's all over the lot, and it involves far more suppression of illegal immigration than it does anything else, right, which, as Professor Hyman has made very clear, is not the number one security problem that we're facing. It's a problem. It's a political problem. It needs to be dealt with in many ways, but I don't believe that we found a very effective way to do it. So number one is to focus our attention, and I think it has to be singular. I think if we're going to be successful in this, the attention needs to be first and foremost to work with Mexico to get rid of the cartel organizations. I think we've got a year to do it, and maybe I'm optimistic on that. I think the time is absolutely critical, and I think the first thing we have to do is stop the money, and hopefully I've made that clear about 20 times, but my big mystery is why not? Justice Department, Homeland Security are working on border security. Treasury is not. And I think that's a appalling situation that our country is not unified in a border security effort.
The money laundering, I have heard, and I don't know if this is true or not, that in many cases, as in the case of Wachovia, it's cheaper for the bank to pay the fine, promise good behavior for 1 or 2 years.
1 year.
That's what I am asking you. That's what I am asking you.
Cost of doing business.
Exactly. That's what I have heard.
Unlike the iron triangle on my right, I'm not going to be that cynical. But unfortunately, you had a bank that was facing collapse. They saw an awful lot of easy profits if they just looked the other way, and they did it on a monumental scale. And I have reason to believe they're not the only ones. So how do you explain that, given the carnage in Mexico, given almost 40,000 casualties? That illegal money, I think, did more than any other factor to make that destabilization possible.
All right, in the back there.
This is on? Yeah. Hi, my name is Chris Wilson. I'm a consultant with the Wilson Center here at the Mexico Institute. I have a question. I was hoping you could talk a little bit about the non-security related effects of the security policies put in place at the border since 9/11. I was curious if you believe there's been a thickening of the border, and sort of what has been impacted by that, in what ways. The numbers that I've seen have shown that the amount of human traffic, just not trafficking, but just people crossing the border, has declined over the last decade on the southwest border.
So thickening means strangulation?
Yeah, well,
thickening, more friction, harder to cross the border because
right.
of security impacts.
The numbers were not in decline until the fiscal crisis, the bursting of the bubble in late 2007. In fact, the peak of unauthorized border crossing was in the middle of this past decade, which was a time when not every single measure that we currently have was in place, but the vast majority of them were. The buildup of the Border Patrol, the full frontal enforcement, and the buildup in the size of the Border Patrol, and the improvement in their resources and their technology started in late 1993 and was well in place by the middle of the past decade. And yet, the bubble construction industry apparently attracted enough cyclical migrants to account for enormous increases in unauthorized flows. So we know that fall in unauthorized flows was at least coincided with the rapid decay in the U.S. economy. Now, I think that it is much more expensive, much more dangerous, and much harder to cross the border. We have good evidence for that. And I think that it does, in fact, discourage people from crossing the border. but it has two effects. One is they will still attempt to cross the border if they think that there is enough of a payout in terms of their life projects, earning money and so forth, to get into the U.S., and that's what we saw in this past decade. The other thing is that it's trapped people inside the United States. So in an academic piece that a colleague and I, Gina Nunez, and I published a few years ago, we referred to these things as entrapment processes. And we discussed it in the border region, but there's also people who have looked at it more demographically in the interior. I think one of the things that happened to the combination of people being trapped inside the United States, reluctant to go back and forth cyclically to Mexico or Central America, combined with the decline in employment openings, so that that population that's already in the U.S. is filling the openings when they do open up. And it's much there. You know, everybody talk about sophisticated organizations. Migrant networks have long distance calling cards and cell phones, and U.S. employment conditions that information gets to Mexico and Central America accurately and rapidly. And so I think that what has happened is that the enforcement has had some effect, but only under the peculiarly bad economic circumstances that we're in right now. Now, am I sure of this? Nobody's sure of it. This is a matter of policy and scholarly debate right now, whether those declining numbers are the result of the economy or not. But I think that they are certainly substantially part of the economy, because we know that in circa 2007, people were crossing in huge numbers.
I think we have to ask what is meant by a 21st century border, and I haven't seen yet a clear articulation of that. I presume it means goods and services flow freely and with minimal interruption, and criminal activity is stopped. That would be my definition of a 21st century border. Certainly I see in the Arizona border significant interruptions. Commercial traffic takes 6 to 7 hours to make the clear through the ports, and for perishable produce, that's devastating. So that has a serious negative impact. The people walking across now face an hour to an hour and a half, almost guaranteed, depending on the time of day, of course, and the day of the week. That has put a tremendous damper upon trade on the border. Estimates that I hear are 20 to 25% today are down from their peaks. Maybe not devastating, but certainly a very serious hit. But the other half of it has not just been enforcement and the slowness of moving back and forth, and it's the whole publicity that when the country believes, and you hear it over and over again on the news, that the border is a virtual free fire zone. It's unlikely to get investment. It's unlikely to get tourists. It's unlikely to get even the casual senior who wants to go to Mexico to buy drugs, legal drugs. And I've got a little pin here, and I'm sorry you can't see it, but it is the new publicity program put out by the city of Nogales, Arizona. And it says, Nogales, Arizona, a great little place to be, and, quote, at the bottom, you're among friends, unquote. And the reason they're putting their hard money, and they don't have much of it, into this program is that they don't believe anybody believes it from the rest of the country, that Nogales has, along apparently with El Paso, Texas, one of the lowest violent crime rates. They can't remember when the last murder was in Nogales. They've got an incredibly safe community. Part of it is because well, I'll stop there.
Okay, more questions. Rob, give me a second. Are there any other questions lingering in the back? I don't want to turn this into an entire session with Mexico Institute personnel, but if you're thinking of questions, I'll turn it over to Rob.
Donnelly from the Mexico Institute. I guess I have two questions. One is spurred by Professor Heyman's mention of an iron triangle, and wanted to know the panel's thoughts on the extent to which border security is developing into an industrial complex. I mean, SBI Net, yes, is a faulty technology, but it's also an important contract for Boeing. The border wall might have questionable public policy benefits, but it's an important public works project. So I'm curious if you could maybe amplify that a bit. And I'm also curious about your thoughts on prevailing beliefs on border security within the Democratic Party. In the last few months, important Democratic affiliated think tanks such as NDN and the Center for American Progress have waged, I guess you could call it something of a battle, I suppose, regarding the importance of border security, whether, as NDN says, it's an important prerequisite for immigration reform, or whether, as the Center for American Progress says, it's completely bankrupt and the goalposts are continuously moving on it to the point where there's no point in pursuing it, and like the panel said, we can't define it. So I was just curious if you could speak to those two issues.
Well, I think that to deal with the second one first, I think that the honest truth is that the Democratic Party and the various progressive coalition members, short of the actual immigrant advocacy organizations, who I think have a different perspective on this, are desperately afraid that the symbolism of the border will wreck their effort to bring about a long-term solution to immigration. And you get contradictory and incoherent responses, though each of these things are picking up real pieces of the truth, because they're trying to figure out a way to reply to what is apparently a winning anti-immigrant discourse, which is fear the border, fear the border, fear the border. And I think that speaks really to your first point. I think that we are in a situation where there's a convergence of two key political processes in the United States. One of them is prejudice against Mexico and Mexicans, because we're in a period of great demographic change. Now, I happen to think this is a terrific future, okay? As the grandchild of a previously picked on immigrant group, Eastern European Jews. And then before that, there were the Irish and Germans. And teaching at a university that is 90% Mexican origin. I look forward to it. El Paso is a beautiful vision of the future. It's a safe, livable community. But I think that there is so on one hand, there's a political frame that the border equals Mexico, and Mexico is threatening. On the other hand, there are specific bureaucratic interests. I happen to think that there are other interests out there that would like to see an immigration reform. I don't think that the business interests are coherent. In fact, I think the bigger business interests are probably pro-immigration reform. But there are business interests and bureaucratic interests in the homeland security industrial complex. And I do think that they spend a lot of money and energy conspiring with DHS to come up with programming that then's introduced through congressional committees. I mean, all of you who are in the world of policy should be familiar. If you're not already, you should make yourself familiar with this concept of the Iron Triangle. So I think clearly the Iron Triangle is at work, but it also requires a real mass popular politics of fear of the Mexican-American future. I think we should look forward to the Mexican-American future.
I think the quickest way to kill the wall idea is to call it a public works project. So I would sort of take exception to that. And in Arizona, as you probably know, they're trying to raise private money to do it. And they are making sure that everybody knows that the actual construction will be done by prison labor. So I'm not sure it's a border industrial complex at work, but rather a massive piece of symbolism, which in the hands of John McCain and many others is very powerful. Build the dang fence was his campaign slogan, and frankly, it did him very well. I'm a political casualty of Senate Bill 1070. I was 10 points ahead in March and 25 points behind running for governor in May. So I felt, that's a pretty wide swing because my opponent decided to sign that piece of legislation. I believe then and believe now that it obscured people's vision of what's actually happening, and that there is a safety concern, there is a law enforcement issue, which is exactly what 1070 and other pieces of anti-immigrant legislation have stepped on. The fact that the police chiefs around the country say that they're dying in major cities because they no longer have community policing to depend on because a whole significant part of the population now is afraid to call an officer, that's a big deal for me. And the fact that we as a nation talk about securing the border and then don't do the first steps necessary to do it, I find very problematic. If we're going to talk about securing the border, let's get it done and go on with other issues for the country, but not continue this dance which talks about it but doesn't seem interested in doing anything about it.
Mark?
Mark Rosenblum, Congressional Research Service. I think you guys have both made, to me, the most important point that you've made is that the tasks of preventing illegal immigration, preventing illegal narcotics, and preventing terrorists, that those are three different projects that require different kinds of enforcement investments. And I think you can also, you've also made the case that even in the post 9/11 period, we've been much more focused on preventing immigration than on preventing drugs and preventing terrorists. And maybe terrorists aren't really an issue on the southern border. Maybe they are. Clearly, drugs are. I think those points need to be amplified. They're important points. Even in your presentations today, they get blurred with, we can or can't do something about immigration on the border. And I think both of you have sort of made the point that, the border is secure, or on the other hand, well, actually, it's just that the economy is down and, this massive investment targeting immigrants is purely symbolic. And maybe you haven't been ambiguous on that. Maybe that's you're trying to make that assertion. But, the politics of immigration, so setting aside questions about what smart things should we be doing to reduce narcotics flows, and that's an important question, and maybe that's all our focus is today. But if we're also focused on what do we need to do to prevent, there is, I think, in Congress a sense that we also want to be preventing illegal immigration, and that we have to have whatever policies. I think that many people in Congress would define that as the first priority, as a higher priority than preventing narcotics from coming in, or an equally important priority. So to say, well, we really need to be going after these cartel leaders because that's how to go after the narcotics, that's fine, but many of the people in Congress are really concerned with preventing illegal immigration also, or foremost. So I wonder if you have ideas about how to accomplish that. And I think that that we need to be careful to not fall into the habit of just, or maybe this is our position, but if your position is, and by the way, we can't do anything about illegal immigration because they're too sophisticated and the problem's too big, so forget about that problem and let's just worry about drugs. I think that's a difficult position for you to advocate, and I hear a little bit of that in your presentation. So can we do something to prevent illegal immigration also?
I would
because
say,
clearly
yeah.
a lot of that happens at the border too.
I would say that at least until 2008, which is also the same time as the decline in the U.S. economy, border enforcement was not even related to preventing undocumented or illegal migration. It wasn't succeeding. The United States, the number of people who were in the U.S. without authorization was growing throughout that period in spite of heavy border enforcement. So if you wanted a policy that addressed unauthorized migration, you might look at employment verification. I personally think that a combination of legalization of the currently existing population and reform of future visas is absolutely necessary. We have clear demographic demonstration that the amount of the flows is about twice the amount of the visas we hand out. We're just not handing out enough visas. We specifically don't hand out enough visas to a small number of countries. Mexico is first among them. We need to change the way we allocate visas. We also don't allocate visas for low-skill employment, even though it's demonstrable that there are certain sectors that are reliant on migrants to do work in some economic sectors, a very limited number of them, but enough to account for millions of people. Those visas are simply not available. Some of that's done through the back door through family reunification visas, but obviously not enough since it's only about half of the demand. So I think we have policy solutions to unauthorized migration. I think the policy solution to unauthorized migration at the border is debatable at best, and I think there's a bunch of other alternatives. The real question politically is the desire for the immigration policy a desire for a successful immigration policy that reduces unauthorized migration? We'll never totally get rid of it, but that reduces unauthorized migration, or is it a desire? Is it a desire to keep out all the immigrants? Because I want to see the people who want to reduce illegal immigration. I want to see them advocate increasing legal immigration. The next time they're out there on the floor talking about how wonderful legal migration is, and they say, let's double the number of visas, then I'm going to be in their camp.
Yeah, I don't think I said what you said I said, but let me be clear. I don't think we can stop the flow of people coming across the border illegally with the procedures we're following now. I do believe it's possible, and I think it's relatively simple, and it has to do with money and organizational attacks. I agree that if we have a comprehensive effort that opens the number of visas and has employer sanctions as part of the program, then you stop the pull that is bringing people across the border. When our agricultural board in the state of Arizona, one of the most conservative groups in America, I think by any objective analysis, says that their future depends, and this is for us, you may not appreciate it, but for us this is revolutionary. It always was the availability of water was the only thing that mattered for our ag community. And in a desert, that's not too hard to understand. They've changed that about 3 years ago to the availability of labor. And they're very adamant and pretty sometimes hysterical about the need to do exactly what the professor said, and that is to make sure that that labor can be available when the crop is ripening. And frankly, I stand with them on that.
And I would add something, which is if we really do want to prioritize the illegality of migration, then we should just simply stop using the word security. So we will prioritize that as our number one policy priority, but it won't be the Department of Homeland Security. It'll go back to being the INS, and then maybe the INS plus customs or something like that. Because frankly, it's not a security issue. There are some small number of dangerous people who move through that flow, and we should be working as a security policy. We very much should be working on taking those dangerous people out of that flow, partly by making it an authorized and inspected flow, right?
Yep.
But I think that it is not anyway a security issue. We can debate whether it's beneficial to the U.S. economy or whether it costs the U.S. economy. We can debate whether it's good for the demographic future of the country or it's not good for the demographic future of the country. But it is not 9/11, and it is not criminal organizations operating high-powered weapons.
And the tragedy of the current policy is that in the mass of people coming across the border, and it's way down, but it's still a mass, it's still a big number, hardened criminals are able to hide in the flock. And what we know in Arizona and across the country when you arrest somebody who's here illegally is who they're not who they are. And that has implications when there are traffic accidents. It has implications in so many different parts of our community that when somebody shows you 10 pieces of identification, none of which actually identify them, you have a whole new set of hurdles to overcome on the law enforcement side. And so I believe very strongly that we need to know who's coming across the border and working in our country and not trying to earn their living with armed robbery or other major crimes. And right now, that is incredibly difficult for law enforcement to do.
I think we have time for one more question, right here, I guess. Could just wait for the microphone, please.
Hi, Lisa Atkins from the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. Kind of going along with what you were saying, there's been a lot of discussion about DHS overstay data, lack of overstay data, some issues compiling overstay data at the ports of entry, especially air and maritime, and there seems to be no overstay data at land borders at all.
There isn't.
Yeah, there isn't yet. So do you think an exit system is possible at the land border, at the land POEs? And if so, do you think the exit system will make us more secure?
The entry system contributes more to security than the exit system. The exit system is useful in terms of going after unauthorized migration. It's not really a security measure as such, because it might tell you who is stayed inside the United States by a method of residuals, who's left there. Now, people underestimate how hard it would be to do anything about that, because then you have to send out U.S. Marshals to arrest people. And you have no idea how hard it is to arrest, let's say, 3.5 to 5 million people. Okay, there would be unbelievable level of expense and logistics. Okay, but that's the exit would enable us by a method of residuals to begin that process. Exits at the ports of entry would be time-consuming. They would be expensive. They would address one issue, which is identifying who stayed in the country. They don't really deal so much with who's coming in, and we're concerned about who is coming into the country from a security standpoint. If you have a transnational assassin coming into the country, if you have somebody who is moving for some terrorist purpose or another, you're more concerned about finding out that they've come into the country and interdicting them and preventing them from coming in than not to find out, not knowing whether they've left. So I think that it's sort of interesting. It could be sort of interesting to know that they haven't left, but why did you let them in the first place? So the entry part of it, which is one of the few things that was done meaningfully as national security, as Homeland Security after 9/11, I think the entry part really is much more important. If you want to go after immigration and you want to go after immigrants and you're ready to go out into U.S. society and trace and arrest 3.5 million people, then let's have an exit system.
Do you have any parting words of wisdom here?
Parting words. Well, I hope we've made clear, because it just seems like an article of faith. If we're gonna look at the border, let's try to look at it without the blinders of symbolism and philosophy and trying to make another point. But as a security issue, I believe it's a solvable challenge, a big one, but nonetheless one that we can take on if, in fact, we have the various law enforcement and regulatory aspects of the United States government, state and federal, focused on the same objective. And I think that starts with defining that objective, and then it means let's not work at cross purposes within our house, because the objective, and I think it's fundamental to all of you being here today, but let me just repeat, I think it's overwhelmingly important that Mexico, as an important both diplomatic and economic partner, is at risk. They have paid an incredible price during this struggle, and I think it's the right struggle, and I think it's a noble one. But we have given them some assistance through the Merida Initiative and elsewhere. But that last effort that it takes to win this game is something the U.S. has simply not been committed to. And if we were, we wouldn't be allowing billions of dollars to flow illegally across our borders. We wouldn't be lagging in putting stored value instruments onto our list of watches, and we still haven't done it right. We wouldn't be doing counterproductive things that, in fact, fuel the cartels and make them better every day at what they do. And what's happening in the meantime is these international criminal organizations are becoming part of the economy. They're taking over petroleum distribution. They're taking over large aspects of formerly legitimate economic drivers in Mexico and elsewhere in the hemisphere. And as that happens, they become far harder for us to find and to eliminate. And I believe the destabilization immediately south of the professor's home is just the beginning of what can happen as the cartels expand their power south of the border. And the violence is just a small part. It's essentially we're fighting for the rule of law in this hemisphere. And the stakes are incredibly high and the time is very short. And I think it's time for the United States to focus its attention, stop talking symbolically about building the dang fence, something that even as a public works project doesn't work, Sitting here in Arizona, when we see every day a new tunnel being discovered, I just went back and looked at the headlines concerning discovered tunnels and found out that they average about one a week over the past several years. And the joke is that Nogales is someday going to just drop 40 feet because the ground underneath it has been completely eliminated. Obviously, a wall, that and the overstays are pretty much proof that you don't just build an edifice and have it solve your problem. It's much more complicated than that. It involves intelligence. It involves sophisticated law enforcement. We have the tools. We just need to use them.
I think one of the great ironies, and I'll end with this, for me, is that ironically, the U.S. is sort of clear about what it wants to do in Mexico and what it wants Mexicans to do to fight organized crime. I mean, we could quibble over it, but they have a strategy laid out, a 3-pillar strategy, and there's a long relationship there. But they don't have a very clear strategy in this country. And suddenly when you start talking to them about guns, well, we fumble there because there's the NRA and there's the Second Amendment, and we don't devote the resources to fight money laundering, like you say. We leave it up to the states. There's just so many ways in which suddenly when it's on our terrain, which is what is driving this violence in Mexico, we kind of fumble and are not sure and clear about what the strategy should be at home. So that, to me, is the tragic irony of all of this so much.
And my misanswer to the border industrial complex question was focused on buildings, and I think we get diverted by buildings and sort of bricks and mortar. But the industrial complex that is in fact profiting from the instability on the border is the financial complex. And if you have to identify a border industrial beneficiary, I'm afraid it's the banks like Wachovia, and that needs to be paid attention to. And it isn't because it isn't located on the border. It's located in Chicago, and New York, and Miami. And that's not the border, according to most senators' interpretation.
I would say that we have, I would say that we're arriving at a fork in the road. And the violence in Mexico has maybe made us more aware of this fork in the road. And one side of the fork of the road is called focusing on border security. And the other side of the fork of the road is called focusing on immigration interdiction, immigration enforcement. And we can decide that we want to put our resources into border security, or we can put our resources into making it difficult, dangerous, and expensive to get to the United States. Now, you may prioritize the second one. Obviously, I wouldn't, but I think that that's a public policy decision and debate, obviously, that needs to be had, but it shouldn't be called border security.
Mary, did you have any last words you want to say?
I just wanted to thank everybody for coming this afternoon and for participating. And of course, if you would like to read these papers, you can go to www.immigrationpolicy.org to read this, see a link of this presentation. I suppose if you're watching it at home, you already saw the link of this presentation, but to pass on to your friends.
Great. Thank you, Mary, and to our speakers. And thank you all for your attention. You're dismissed.
Class.